About the role of neurodiversity in ABA services. And our three panelists today, I'm going to start out with Ashton. Ashton Benedickt goes by pronoun she, her. She's a board-certified behavior analyst, adjunct faculty and research in the field of ABA. She is also autistic and carries further OCD and post-PTSD diagnoses, which have equipped her with a highly valuable and unique perspective that is much needed within the ABA and greater behavior analytic community. She has taken this perspective and applied it to her clinical work, primarily focused on teen and adult populations with severe challenging behaviors and dual diagnoses. Her areas of expertise include ACT, functional analyses, and neurodiversity, which she has utilized within a scientific framework across a variety of populations and individuals. Prior to entering the field of ABA, she worked in adjacent fields such as an ESL teacher, special education teacher, and youth group facilitator for at-risk LGBTQIA+ populations, as a public speaker for DEI in the hospital and corporate sectors, and additionally volunteered with the Humane Society International, NOAA, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and in Micronesia for the University of Washington's Behavioral Avian Ecology program. Shortly after she returned to the U.S., she began working at a private school for individuals with autism, and simultaneously with her first ABA agency as a direct line staff in the homes in Florida. Following this, she moved to California, where she started working with Dr. Rachel Taylor and Benjamin Hyman at the Center for Applied Behavior Analysis. And she's been working in the field nearly a decade across levels, beginning as a behavior interventionist and worked her way up to a BCBA supervisor, and is now a regional director, and she is also a SIG president. And as such, she's acquired a great deal of knowledge in both the clinical and administrative aspects of our field. Brian Millstein is our next speaker, our panelist, and he likes to describe himself as a human, which I like a lot. First, he is a human who happens to be of the autism neurotype. He is also a BCBA and licensed behavior analyst for the state of Tennessee. He worked as a special education teacher for 7 years prior to moving to behavior analysis. And in December of 2018, he started the Bearded Behaviors social media page as an effort to make ABA education more fun and interesting. Since then, Brian has been a guest on multiple podcasts, hosts 2 podcasts, the O Behave podcast and the Act Natural podcast, and is currently serving as a member at large for the Open Educational Resource SIG for ABAI. Brian loves behavior analysis as a science and a field and is committed to improving the field. And our third panelist is Justin Lee. He's a PhD and is the Chief Clinical Officer for Autism Partnership Foundation. He's the Executive Director for the Progressive Behavior Analyst Autism Council, the Associate Director for ABA Doctoral Studies at Endicott College, and the Executive Director for Contemporary Behavior Consultants. He received his doctorate degree in behavioral psychology from the Department of Applied Behavioral Science at the University of Kansas. And his research interests include progressive ABA, improving behavioral intervention, social behavior, and methodologies to improve the lives of autistic individuals and individuals diagnosed with ASD, whatever your preference is. Justin has over 100 publications in either peer-reviewed journals, books, or book chapters, and has presented at both national and international professional conferences and invited events. He served on numerous editorial boards for behavior analytic and autism journals. So please welcome our 3 panelists, and thank you for of how tough this topic actually is. And it might elicit or evoke unpleasant or uncomfortable feelings and thoughts. And I want to remind everyone to try their best to remain to be kind and compassionate. As the audience, with any questions you have for our panelists, and as our panelists trying to talk about this difficult topic. I'd also like us to remember Pat Fryman and taking a contextual approach to this. And what I mean by that is taking a behavior analytic lens that, I don't know if you guys have seen his YouTube, but it's great if you haven't. There is no such thing as a bad boy. And basically that's kind of the same sentiment as the learner's always right. So in behavior analysis, we don't put blame on people. We don't point fingers. We look at the context in which behaviors occur, and we talk about that. And that, I think, is one of the beautiful things about our field, is we can do that. We can talk about these difficult subjects in a loving, compassionate way by looking at it from a scientific standpoint. Under what conditions do we engage in these behaviors? And what are the conditions we need to create to change those behaviors if we identify behaviors that need to be changed? And so with that, moving forward, I'll move on to our questions for our panelists. So my first one goes to all three. I think all of them kind of do. So I want to start out with going through, I'll start with Ashton and we can just go down the line. What does ABA mean to you?
I'm wondering if I should move over.
Oh yeah.
Hi. Well, first I'd like to say I love applied behavior analysis. I started on a track of wanting to be in clinical psychology, and I very quickly got into the field and met my first client and was able to make those noticeable changes within the data, and it was all very organized and structured, and it wasn't subjective, and I fell in love. I have the 4-term contingency tattooed on my forearm. Literally, I love our science. And what I love about our science is that it is not necessarily focused on a diagnosis. And to me, what ABA really is an evidence-based way to alter environments to support the most vulnerable populations.
Ryan?
So I wrote some notes down because working through the nervousness. So I was a special ed teacher before I came into behavior analysis, and I was a behavior special ed teacher for much of that time, and I was told I worked miracles, and it wasn't until I came into behavior analysis that I understood the terminology of what I was actually doing that was right, because and I also learned what I was doing wrong. And so for me, ABA means hope. For someone who struggles with behavior concerns, life can be a literal hell. So ABA can and does provide hope for many people. It's systematic, it's data-driven, it's applied, technological, it is effective, and it can create lasting change for the lives of those that suffer and struggle. Applied behavior analysis changes lives for the better. So make no mistake, when I provide criticism towards our field, it is not because I do not love this field. It is exactly the opposite. I love this field. It is the first place that I have been where I have been unconditionally accepted. This is, you are my people. This is my field.
I think, hello. Mike? Thanks.
Could be a switch on it or something.
Oh, that would be to have to learn technology. That's I'd have to get Joe up here. First of all, thank you two for being on this panel with me. I think that these are difficult conversations, and I think having it in a public forum like this is going to lead to positive change. And I don't know if I can say it better than they just said it. I think the hope is beautiful, and what our field can do is a really great answer. We are products of our environment, and I'm a product of the University of Kansas. So it's hard for me when I talk about how I define applied behavior analysis, not to go back to Bear, Wolf, and Risley in 68 and 87, what Brian just said. And if you were in my talk earlier today, my favorite article, Wolf 78 on social validity. When I talk to my colleagues, to consumers, to parents, to other professionals about what ABA means to me, or how I talk about it, how I define it, I talk about it as its procedures which are grounded in the science of ABA, which are used to work with our consumers to make meaningful change, socially significant and socially important change. Now, if you were in my talk earlier today, the type of ABA that I endorse is one of flexibility. It's one of clinical judgment. It's one of in-the-moment decision-making. When doing that, we're not following rigid protocols. We are doing what's in the client's best interest. We have flexibility to do that. We're not cookie cutter in any which way, shape, or form. It's one of compassionate and caring and making sure that we're putting the client's values really at the center of what we are doing. To me, ABA is love at the end of the day. I think I said that. I think Brian can attest to that. I said that in my previous talk. It's about love. It's about care. And when we do it with a high degree of quality, we see amazing outcomes. We see just amazing outcomes. I think about it. The children I work with who came in non-vocal verbal and within the fully communicational, we'd see adolescents who are isolated, lonely, depressed, and they're wanting friendships and meaning social relationships and see the joy that that's brought them. Or adults who are engaging in serious self-injury or aggression and seeing that they're no longer doing behaviors that harm themselves. So to me, it's hope, it's love, it's quality, it's hopefully what everyone's doing. And I think the thing that probably all of us agree on this panel is it's not happening enough at that level. We're not doing a good enough job of making sure quality intervention is occurring for our consumers.
Thank you. So, getting right into it, what is neurodiversity? And why is understanding neurodiversity important for behavior analysts? Go ahead and start.
When I look at neurodiversity, or at least my understanding of neurodiversity, is kind of a switch from the medical model and over to a social disability model, in that there are neurological differences that occur that are naturally occurring, and each person can experience these differences at different levels. I think something else I want to say here is that I also don't think that the spectrum is linear. And so when I'm looking at neurodiversity, I'm also thinking about it in that scope, and then making sure as neurodiversity aligns itself with other diversity movements and other similar movements, that we are also making sure people like me who are on the stage make sure to say, yes, I'm autistic, but I am not speaking for everyone that is autistic. And I think that that's a big, I think intersectional feminism takes a big role in my comprehension of neurodiversity.
So behavior analysis, or rather radical behaviorism, is a science of observation and a science of description. We're observing and describing what we see. And the interesting thing is that neurology has caught up with us, and in some ways has progressed beyond where we're at, because our technology has improved to the point that we can see what's happening in the brain. There's a really cool video that I saw on YouTube where you're watching neurons of a fetus connecting, literally as it's happening. And so that's our sibling science. And our sibling science has demonstrated through research that there are multiple types of neurological structures out there, and that those neurological structures can and do inform preferences. And behavior analysis, we have tons of research on preference and preference assessment. So when we're talking about neurodiversity, neurotypes, and all that, we're literally seeing through research and explanation of what behavior analysis has already observed, which is we all have differences and we have different preferences. So neurodiversity is acknowledging those differences and acknowledging that the neurotype of an individual has a phylogenetic influence on their preferences and how they interact with the world around them. There's still more to learn. We're still learning. I love exploring other branches of science, even as I use it through a behavior analytic lens. And so neurodiversity is behavior analysis at its core.
Thank you.
Well, you're going to see a theme for me, and the theme is when there's definitions, I struggle with them. And I think it's hard to create definitions on the spot like this, and even thinking about the question ahead of time, because it's such complex behavior that we're talking about. And in terms of neurodiversity, if we look back when Singer in the 90s first coined the term, and then it got popularized, it has meant different things to different people. And so I think we would have differences if we asked a bunch of the audience members, and this is at least according to the paper written by Arnold in 2017. To me, what neurodiversity means is that people experience the world in different ways. Therefore, they think differently, they learn differently, they behave differently. And I think this is very compatible to a behavior analytic approach. It's all about individualization and individualized learning, so I have no problem with that. That's great. And I think what it goes further is that these differences should not be seen as deficits. And so that's, to me, part of the definition, or my working definition, of what neurodiversity means. Now, what I've seen in the last 2 years, with neurodiversity, is what some have called the Neurodiversity Movement, or have coined it that. And I'm talking specifically as it relates to autistic individuals. And with that, from my perspective, I've seen people who identify as autistic as part of that movement. I've seen people who identify as behavior analysts as part of that movement. I've seen people who identify both as autistic and behavior analysts in the movement. And there's others who are part of that movement. And like any movement, like any entity, like any company, there's different opinions, different thoughts, different goals, different ways that they voice their opinions and their goals. And so from my perspective, there are some in that movement who are looking to help improve our field, help change it for the better. There are others as part of the neurodiversity movement who are looking to eliminate behavior analysis as it relates to autistic individuals. And so that's my definition, I guess, of neurodiversity and the movement, which is, I think, part of the reason why we're here today.
Thank you. I don't know if you can answer this because it kind of speaks to the flexibility with the definition, but what other diagnoses would you guys say fall under neurodiversity?
So ADHD is classified as a disorder, but I consider that neurotype, I've actually dubbed it with my own little name. I call it an extreme multitasker. and I am an extreme multitasker as well as being autistic. It's the squirrel portion is kind of fun. There are other neurotypes out there, and some neurotypes have some overlap with disorder. And ASD, and I'm very careful with my language there, autism spectrum disorder is a disorder of the autistic neurotype. You cannot be ASD and not have the autism neurotype. Conversely, there are other disorders out there. So for example, Tourette syndrome is a common one. There's some movements that believe that PTSD, because it affects neurology, is included, and I'm not going to be the one to say that it shouldn't be included. I think that it's perfectly acceptable to include that. OCD, basically anything affecting the neurological structure can be viewed as a neurotype. And then if you look at it through, because I believe the social model and the medical model can work in tandem, You can look at the disorder, through the lens of disorder, if it's affecting the ability for the individual to succeed and function. But I'd like to be very careful with that, because sometimes the reason why it affects the ability to succeed and function is because of societal structure, not because of the individual. And so, for example, some folks would consider stimming to be something that is a part of ASD. Unless it's causing serious harm to the individual or to those around them, I would argue that that is a societal definition, not a disorder. If it causes serious harm, and I mean physical harm, then we can consider that a disorder, but we have to be very careful with that.
Thank you. No?
No, we're good.
Okay, now we get into the real tough stuff. All right, so I don't think it's any secret that we've been accused of abuse, and there's sentiment out there that all ABA is abuse. So I want to talk about first, how would you define abuse?
I actually have looked up several definitions of the word abuse, and the one that I like the most is the noun. And it just says to use something improperly or to implement something improperly. And the reason why I like that definition is because it doesn't require us to then engage in some mentalistic gymnastics about intent. And what I think is important in this discussion is that, in general, I believe humans, parents, clinicians, people who are helping people, do the best they can, and in general, have good intentions. Unfortunately, you can still cause great harm when you have the best of intentions. And I think that something that behavior analysts need to kind of look at when they're thinking about this is self as context exercises, looking at how, if these conversations make you feel uncomfortable, there's a reason that they're making you feel uncomfortable. And so a lot of times what I find when I'm consulting with neurotypical clinicians is that it makes them feel uncomfortable because in actuality they do feel guilty about something that they have implemented or something that they have done. And they should feel guilty, and guilt, by the way, is good. It's a human thing that you should feel when you are behaving in ways that are not in alignment with your own values and not in alignment with our society's values. And so what I would say is throughout this whole presentation, without anytime you're having a conversation about neurodiversity, think about it in a way that you're allowing yourself to sit with your uncomfortable feelings and really analyze where they're coming from and understand that it's okay, it doesn't make you a bad person, and sitting with them can actually help you move towards your values and your goals and the values and goals of our science, instead of moving away from things that can threaten your vision of yourself as a hero or as a helping person.
So along the same lines, I looked up, as Ashton, I looked up the definition of abuse because I wanted to have a better comprehension of that. And one of the terms was also improper or excessive use. But I also noticed a hurting maltreatment was another one. That's a simplification, but a good way of looking at it. So therefore, abuse in the context of applied behavior analysis is the failure to see and engage with the individuals, including imposing our culture and preferences on them. And this is important. Autism as a neurotype, we have a culture. And it's really important to acknowledge that. And I love the updated ethics that the BACB put out, because cultural competence doesn't just refer to cultures from people who come from different areas than our own. It doesn't just refer to subcultures in the classical sense, but it also refers to the culture of the neurotype. So I'm going to digress slightly. When we're talking about, for example, teaching white lies to an autistic person, that is cultural imposition. That is attempting to dominate somebody by pushing your culture on them. Instead of teaching white lies, which I've seen some research done on, and the intent was kind, but instead, what about thanking somebody politely for something, for example? Because for me, if somebody gives me a gift and they ask, do you like it? I'm not gonna lie to them. I'm gonna say, thank you very much for the thought. I'm glad that you thought about me. And then if they're like, well, what did you like? And I'm like, not really, but I like that you thought about me. And that's what matters, is that you're trying to connect with me and I'm trying to connect with you. So thank you for that. And that is just one small example about how cultural competence is essential. And when we fail to be competent in culture, then we are in effect being abusive. Because we're pushing ourselves, we're using colonialism to push an idea on somebody else that is not theirs, a value that's not theirs. Second, failure to implement behavior analytic principles at an individual level, which includes dogmatic application rather than individual case-based application. So those would be the two areas that I would argue behavior analysis can and has and does act in an abusive way.
So I think we could have all gone on Zoom together, because we all were looking at multiple definitions online, and we'll probably streamline the process a little bit. It's a definition, so I'm going to struggle with it, because I think it's a complicated definition. And I think it's a complicated definition. I've been on committees, I've been with other professionals, I've been with autistic adults talking about it, and it took weeks to get some agreement on like a sentence. It was really tough. To me, I'm going to do a simple definition. I think it's when a person, which could be a behavior analyst, could be a technician, could be a parent, could be a teacher, paraprofessional, could be anybody, intentionally engages in behavior that causes psychological or emotional or physical harm to anybody. And so, you know, before I got into autism, or like the field of autism, I was a truancy diversion specialist at the University of Kansas. That's what I had to get my grad degree in. And I just remember talking to Jan Sheldon, who was a behavior analyst, not BCBA, because she was a behavior analyst before there was a BCBA, or BACB. And she was also a lawyer. And she always talked about these definitions are meant to be somewhat vague so that the courts can decide on the appropriate, punishment for whatever would happen in court. And so I kind of like the vagueness in the definition, because I think it gives us some interpretation of what is right and what is wrong, versus a narrow definition, which could be used in the wrong way.
Thank you. As someone that studied abuse for many, many years, I don't have a good definition either. I kind of landed on maybe trauma, but I don't know if I 100% buy it, which I define as being presented with the aversive stimuli without an option to escape or avoid, kind of what Feynman was talking about. So that's a trauma stimulus, and then your response to that when you're not given an option to escape or avoid is what creates trauma responses. And I think they're very much aligned. I don't know if they're the same, but they're definitely in a frame of coordination.
I think the difference is that Justin said that he believes that it's intentional, and I think that that's where the difference is. Your example would actually be more in alignment with the neurodiversity movement, only because something that we're really trying to get out there to the clinicians is that you are probably engaging in abusive practices unintentionally. And I think that that's an important differentiation there.
My concern with unintentional is there's things, if you don't define it in a way, there's things that someone could say is abusive that it's just clearly not. So, for example, our company's right by Pacific Coast Highway, for those of you in California, large street, right? And if a client ran out in the street, right? Can I do this really quick?
For it.
And I did this, right, and hurt them, but I'm saving them from jumping into that street. Someone could say that was abuse. And I'm saving their life, essentially. I'm not letting them play Frogger. So I worry about the word, and I did have the word when I was thinking about unintentional, but I think it opens the door for too many things that people could claim as abuse when it's not. If Brian was running across the street or walking across the street, and I just went like this because a car is coming, and he ends up hurting his shoulder, to me that's not abuse at the end of the day, and someone could say it, and that's where I get worried with the word of unintentional.
So I think a big part of understanding this concept of intent versus lack of intent is context is a core component. Context is king. But also what's important to understand is there's discrimination in the behavior analytic way. Discrimination training. I have done things in the past towards others that were abusive. That's just a fact. It's a hard thing for me to accept, but I've had to learn to accept it. I have made mistakes. At the time, I did what I knew best. And a question I like to ask people is, if you knew then what you knew then, would you still make that same decision? Because we can't say what I know now I knew then. That's impossible. That's breaking the laws of physics and the time travel. Time travel's a mess, okay? The point being, yes, one can have been a perpetrator of abuse without intending to. One can cause harm without intending to. The question is, can one also observe oneself and grow? And I would argue that the core of radical behaviorism and functional contextualism is, yes, we can. We can do better. We can be different. We can change the way we operate within the environment. And so a big part of dealing with this question of abuse is also dealing with our relationship with ourselves in relation to that. Looking at our story that we tell ourselves. And a lot of times so first off, let me interrupt myself there. I have yet to meet a behavior analyst who is not a caring person. I have yet to meet a behavior analyst who did not have the core value of caring and helping others. So to argue that one has to have intent in order to be abusive is to basically be mentalistic in nature. Conversely, one can make mistakes and have perpetuated abuse, but then acknowledge, apply discrimination training towards oneself, and then change and do better. And that would be my argument with regards to intent versus lack of.
So you guys have kind of gotten into this a little bit, but what are some examples of abusive practices?
Well, there are quite a few examples. I think one of the examples that I see most often is something that Brian was talking about earlier, and I really love the way that you described that we have a culture. By the way, Brian and I are friends. One time he made me a shirt, and he asked me if I liked it, and I was like, no. But I really appreciate it, and we're still friends. We do have... we have our own culture, is kind of what we were getting at, and I think that that is kind of the most pervasive abuse that I do see is this push of neurotypical culture on our autistic clients. And I think the reason why that happens, you will often, I'll go into a school district or even just a behavioral agency or a group home, and I'll see people actively targeting stereotypy for reduction. And often the rationale behind that is that if they are stimming constantly, they're not going to be able to get through their academics, they're not going to make friends, kids are going to make fun of them. Those, believe it or not, are all a part of neurotypical culture and neurotypical values. They are not always, not saying that they're never, because again, I don't speak for everyone, but often they are not in alignment with autistic culture, and we really do have our own culture. We get along quite nicely with each other. I can sit and talk to Brian about trains all day if I wanted to, and even if he has no interest in trains, guess what? He's gonna sit and listen to me because he knows I'm gonna let him info dump on me about whatever topic he wants to. And that's the type of reciprocation that we have in our communities. And I think when you have behavior analysts saying they have to do this because it's socially significant, because they need to have friends and they need to, that's where I see abuse happening. And I will say that it's often this is an extreme example, but it's often dangerous. It can be life-threatening. I recently had a situation where I acquired a consultative client that had previously had his stereotypy targeted for reduction, to the point that client then began engaging in life-threatening elopement in order to gain access to uninterrupted stereotypy. And was able to go in and talk to the teachers about, yeah, it's, playing with trains and making the right noise when he's playing with trains isn't where it's at, guys. We need to just take a step back, and I'll tell you what, eventually he was doing his schoolwork and was actually able to attend to more neurotypically valued social interactions. But it took me training everyone in this child's environment, teachers, nannies, everybody, to honor his sensory needs. And once we met him there, we were able to get him to a place where he wants to be socially, not where parents and teachers and society thinks he needs to be based off what his neurotypical peers are doing.
So, as a special ed teacher, I had a classroom. It was a little closet, and my number one intervention was lunchtime, where all of the kids, neurotypical or otherwise, were welcome to come in out of the noisy environment and enjoy lunch together and interact with each other. And it was hell. Because it was me and an aide, and we were there and basically shaping behaviors as it was going. But it was a hell that I loved to be in. It was I guess, the crucible. And in that environment, I had a couple peers who had been in school together. One was presented as a, big air quotes here, typical autistic individual with the stimming, the rocking, the flapping, those sorts of things. And there was another autistic peer who, his special interest was football. And he was very good at being accepted by peers. And in this environment, that was a bit of a crucible. The first peer was stimming. He was stressed out. It was very obvious. And the other peer got upset with him and yelled at him. And yelled at him and said, "Why can't you be normal?" And I took the second one, our football guy, and I pulled him into my little closet within the closet. That was my office. And we had a conversation where I talked to him about how this is just who he is. You're still his friend, right? You still love him? Yeah? Okay. This is who he is. And if you accept him for who he is, then he's going to be better. He's going to be connected with you, and you're going to be connected with him. And by better, I don't mean stopping doing something or starting doing something. I mean, he's going to know that you're safe with him and he's safe with you. And at the end of that conversation, he went out, without me prompting him, apologized to his friend. Fast forward 3 weeks later, I'm doing hall monitoring, and I hear football peer explaining to his peers that our stimming peer is just who he is, and we need to love him for who he is. And by the end of that school year, the stimming peer was not coming into my lunchroom every day. He was coming in maybe once or twice a week. And he was being included with his peers. He was a part of a community, and all of his peers loved him for who he was. And I would argue that the number one intervention that we can have is shaping our culture and understanding that. And so, yes, stemming, as an example, or stem reduction, it can be abusive. I would also argue as another example that extinction without using differential protocols is a common example of abuse in behavior analysis. Furthermore, extinction where we're not understanding the difference between using the upper brain, the problem-solving brain, because every single example I hear about extinction in education for behavior analysis is referring to the problem-solving brain, the upper brain working and trying to resolve it. We're talking about, vending machines, knocking on doors, things like that, okay? But I have yet to hear in an ABA education setting extinction being as an example of extinction in a survival condition. And so this is my example. Drowning. Primary reinforcer, oxygen. Access to oxygen is being attempted, right? When somebody is in survival mode, you do not use extinction and you do not tell them, use your words. You get them out of survival mode. You get them to a place where they're safe. And that's one of the biggest mistakes that we have in behavior analysis, is we are not taught to see the difference, not taught to understand that, yes, extinction is a principle, it exists in nature, but it needs to be very carefully applied. And it should never be applied in survival mode, and it should always be applied in a differential when it's outside of survival mode. And I would argue that Dr. Leaf's efforts with the progressive behavior analyst is pushing towards that, is pushing towards us being more flexible and responding, is improving our understanding and making sure that we have and do exercise clinical judgment. And so I would argue that that is in line with what we're trying to do here. And therefore, that is to help address the problem that we have of ABA being utilized in an abusive manner.
Thank you.
Well, I appreciate that acknowledgement, and it doesn't get on me, Brian, that you say that, because it's something that we believe in very much, having equality, and that we don't have as much quality today as we should. It's been something for 20 years I've been talking about, that we have to improve our standards, and our standards are too low. We have to improve our training, and our training is not sufficient. We have to improve our interventions, and they're not improving fast enough. Brian is sitting over there in my talk, and I think for 1 hour, that's all I was talking about, is how we have to continue to improve. And so I do want to say that. Now I'm going to get to the unpopular part of my answer here, and it's going to be unpopular to some of this audience, and it might be unpopular to some of the members here, but that's, I think, what we're about, and being uncomfortable a little bit. To me, I don't think ABA is abuse. I have to say it. ABA is a science, just like chemistry and biology. To me, it's the application of that science that we're talking about. Application of the science has created great things. Vaccines. The reason why I believe we are all here today at CalABA once again, it has created horrible things, like the atomic bomb. The reason why we were worried last night, or I was worried last night, with what was happening in the Ukraine. It's the application of that science. And to me, when I talk about abuse, I worry that people are saying ABA is abuse. No, it's the application of that. And it's, to me, as Brian was talking about, it is the malpractice of behavioral intervention. The malpractice of behavioral intervention. Now, I don't know, because we haven't talked about it, but I'm sure, or I assume, that we've all seen this in practice. We've seen malpractice occur. We've seen abusive things occur. I assume many of you have seen. It makes me sick. It makes me disgusted when I see malpractice. You know, I think one thing that we need to do better also, on my list of things we need to do better, is actually have consequences for when people are engaging in abusive practices. That they should not be on editorial boards if they engage in abusive practice. That they should not be invited to conferences or put on when someone's presenting them as a leader in the field when they've been engaged and been found guilty, have due process, but when that occurs. And so to me, it is the malpractice of ABA. And we talk about it, it's hard to know. I'm not going to be willing to say that any procedure is necessarily abusive, because to me it's under what conditions it was done. When it was done with poor quality, yeah, any procedure can be done with malpractice and can be done to be abusive. Now there's things that we talk about, extinction is one, and I think Brian's right, we need to have extinction differential reinforcement procedures in there, and I worry that we're not doing a good enough job about that, and so that could be the malpractice of that. I worry when I see discrete trial teaching being done with not quality and what the results could be in terms of that. So I am worried about the malpractice. Now when we go from the IV intervention to the DV behaviors, it becomes a lot more complicated for me. It's not easy, it's not black and white. I think this is the hard part of our field. So we talk about stereotypy. I don't know. It's individualized. I don't know. Because I know what the research has told me so far. The research has told me that when people engage in stereotypy, it can decrease learning. It can result in missed social opportunities. It has also told me that when individuals engage in certain stereotypic behavior, that it's more likely to lead to serious self-injury, something I'm concerned about. I also know that stereotypy could lead to lower home placement as an adult, so more restrictive environments. It could lead to less jobs or getting jobs. And so for me, it's a tough question. I'm not saying that we necessarily target stereotypy or don't target stereotypy. I wish I had a crystal ball or a time machine that I talked about, because quite frankly, I own a winery and be that, but not be here. But we just don't know. And so I'm not going to say that working on any behavior is necessarily abusive. I do think what Brian's story is touching, and yeah, I love what he said. I wish our culture was like that in general. Trust me, I do. As a father right now, whose child is getting bullied in school for certain behaviors, I wish we were a more accepting culture. I absolutely wish we were. But right now, it's not the world we're living in. I want to change it. I think the first talk today was about changing the world for a better place. But right now, we live in a society where if you're engaging in certain behaviors, you're not going to get a job. You're just not. If you engage in certain behaviors, you might have to have more restrictive placement. And that's what concerns me, is I know that this is a possible reality. And as a clinician, I'm really wanting to make sure that I'm giving my students, my learners, the best chance they have to have happiness, joy, love in their life. So I think this is a very difficult conversation, and we're going away, what I see, from under what conditions to absolutes. Not saying these two are saying that, but what I'm seeing in social media, what I'm seeing at conferences, is we're going away from under what conditions to absolutes, and that's what concerns me.
Thank you. We are running out of time. It's 4:18, so I want to follow up with if you guys have any follow-up to that, and how you guys recommend we should be responding to accusations of abuse in terms of, for our field, how we can get our field to grow and work in a better way with the autistic community.
So I believe that my response will both be a response to what Justin just said, as well as answering that question. First and foremost, Judge Rotenberg Center needs to be closed down. Because they're exercising some really awful practices that do not stand up underneath the legal system's view of what is considered acceptable treatment. What's more, and this is the first time I'm saying this in public in front of a group of people, I refuse to renew my ABAI membership until Judge Rotenberg is no longer allowed at ABAI. Okay, so, and there's a reason I'm saying this, because when someone says all ABA is abuse, it's like saying, and this is not exactly a comparison, please don't understand, please do not consider me misrepresenting or doing a direct comparison, but that's
very similar to saying Black Lives Matter, which they do. And when somebody is saying all the ABA is abuse, it depends on who's speaking. Some people do truly believe that. But, and I personally don't say this, but I know many people who do say this. What they mean is all ABA is abuse until no ABA is abuse. And I am behavior analysis. You are. When you have that credential, you are behavior analysis. We, as individuals and as a community, are responsible when behavior analysis is exercised in a malpractice manner. Period. One of my favorite TED Talks in the world is Jocko Willink and Radical Ownership. I radically own my field, my science. So I'm not going to stop until behavior analysis is, as a standard, trauma-informed, is not abusive. And so my response when somebody makes an accusation of abuse is, instead of getting defensive, listening. Instead of saying, well, I don't do that, saying, that's awful. I'm sorry. Instead of using my words to convince them, using my actions to convince them, to show them. And there are multiple people who, when I first engaged with them, as an autistic individual, I live in what we autistic BCBAs call Middle Earth, a little nerdy there, where I'm in two worlds. I'm on a ban list in multiple autism communities for not being listened to because I advocate for behavior analysis. I've seen it, it's kind of funny. It's also a little sad too, because it hurts a bit. But the only way that we can change is by showing through our actions. And people who previously hated me automatically because I've consistently shown over and over through my actions, through what I do, they now consider me a friend. We change hearts and minds through actions. And when we get defensive, all we're doing is ignoring what they're saying and not communicating. If you were part of that compassionate communication speech earlier, that's exactly what was being spoken to. We need to communicate, and communication means listening. Communication means not getting defensive. Communication means seeing yourself in context, applying your values, and taking committed action towards meaningful change. And that is my recommendation for responding to accusations of ABA's abuse, either individually or as a whole.
I know we're running out of time, but I have so many thoughts when Justin talks, and I don't even know that I should circle back to all of them. I think my main takeaway is that similarly, if your reaction to the neurodiversity movement is to be defensive, sit down, really. You should sit down with yourself, with your feelings, with your protocols, with your mentors, with your mom, your grandma, whoever you need to talk to, and deal with it, and figure out a way to move towards a better ABA, towards making the science that we all love so much survive, and support the individuals that we were designed to help support.
Can I answer, please?
Oh, yes. Oh. Sorry.
Thanks. So 2 years ago, we were here, not in this very room, us in the bar. Rachel Taylor is very sad because the conference is canceled. I go up to Napa because what else am I going to do? I have 3 days away from the kids. I'm going to take the opportunity to be away for 3 days. And I come back and I have a conference. Dr. Taylor and Dr. Tarbox are both at my conference. I'm just going to survival mode, right? Autism Partnership Foundation Survive, begging them to still do the conference. Not sure if it's going to be live or if it's going to be whatever it is, video conferencing, which was not a big thing back then. We survived it, right? We got through it, we did that. Then I'm starting to see stuff occur on social media. I started to see stuff occur in other conferences. And I'm hearing things, and seeing things, that all ABA is abuse. And they want to get rid of ABA. Now, they might be saying all ABA is abuse into non-ABA is abuse, and I agree with that. But,
Great.
That's
awesome.
But I don't think that's how it's being said. I think they're wanting to get rid of ABA as a field. That's my perspective. And it doesn't really matter what my perspective is on this. Because what is occurring from April of 2020 until today is I'm getting phone calls. I'm getting phone calls from parents. Parents with 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, newly diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder by DSM-5 criterion, by independent, not behavior analysts, by psychologists, diagnosticians. And they said they go on a social media page, right? And they see all ABA's abuse. And they say, we're not going to put our children in this. We're not going to put our children in this. Starts with 1 phone call, 2 phone calls, 3 phone calls, dozen phone calls in a week. I don't know why they're contacting me, because I'm not very easy to get a hold of, and I don't return phone calls or texts or emails, as my staff would say. But they keep contacting me. I'm getting this nonstop. This is the perspective of parents. So then I go to a conference. It's an organization conference for providers. A colleague of mine's talking on this very issue. And he's talking, and I'm looking at the chat feature, and the chat feature is saying, yes, parents are calling me, not getting intervention, not getting intervention, not wanting to get intervention. So being caring and compassionate, I'm starting to worry. We have too many children who are seeing this from behavior analysts. Behavior analysts accepting that all ABA is abuse. And for parents who go through the stress, the anxiety, the depression of getting a diagnosis, they're electing not to get important intervention. They're electing not to get important intervention. And so yes, I think one, if we see abuse, if we see it, or it's reported, or mandated reporters, or most of us are, we need to report that to authorities. If you engage in abusive practice, you should report yourself and report yourself to the BACB. Absolutely. Absolutely, I think we need to be compassionate and listen and caring. I agree with that completely. But when I see misinformation out there that has a direct effect on consumers and potential consumers, I'm worried. And so it's not about being defensive for ABA's sake, because for those of you who know me, I've argued against everyone in ABA nonstop. I'm not defending ABA. I argue with everyone. People in this room I've argued with about our practice. I'm worried that if we don't combat misinformation, the detrimental effects it will have for children, adolescents, and autistic adults. And so that is my concern. Additionally, I'm a researcher. My primary role right now is research. That's my primary responsibility. We are making broad claims. I have seen these broad claims being made that escape extinction has always led to harm. Level charts are abusive. And we don't have any data to support this. I'm going to read something, and I don't read, Brian can attest that I didn't read anything on my talk. This is from a paper that we did on PTSD, or response to PTSD. Even with the tremendous success of ABA-based interventions for individuals diagnosed with ASD, it is important to frequently assess the accessibility for our interventions. Those within the field should take every accusation that ABA-based interventions could be potentially traumatic for the individuals receiving those interventions seriously. As such, we encourage researchers to assess consumer opinions of ABA-based interventions, as well as research which accurately measures potential positive and negative collateral effects of ABA, based upon interventions without bias or prejudice. This kind of research would help applied behavior analysts to continue to refine methods and improve ABA-based interventions for individuals diagnosed with ASD. We need to research it. We need to do a better job. But my concern is when we're seeing this, the harm it could cause. And I've seen it too often in the last 2 years. And it makes me very, very worried for probably hundreds of children right now. And so I hope that we can do better on it. As I said in the beginning, there's different opinions out there. There's different people, how they vocalize their opinions. I think when people are saying all ABA is abuse and I want to get rid of all ABA and they're not saying until no ABA is abuse, they shouldn't be invited as keynote speakers to conferences. When behavior analysts are being unprofessional about this stuff, they should not be collaborated with. And so my thing is we need to have consequences for it. Otherwise, our consumers at the end of the day are the ones that will suffer.
Brian, I'm gonna let you finish, but I just wanna let everyone know we are past time, it's 4:31, so please take your time to respond.
I will try to be quick. There's an article that was published in the Kennedy Center for Ethics that looked at behavior analysis as it is dominantly applied in the article's author's terms. They said the dominant species of applied behavior analysis. And I cannot recall off the top of my head the name of the article, but if you email me, I'm happy to send you a link to the article. But the conclusion the authors made in a journal about ethics was that applied behavior analysis as the dominant species that is present now they do not recommend it as being an intervention for autistic individuals, and that there is no onus for that to be an appropriate response. That's damning as an indictment. For a journal that's entire emphasis is on ethics, to hear that, to read that hurt for me to read. Again, I love this science, I love this field. But the reality is that we need to do better. We need to take action. And I believe that being reactive to somebody who's making an accusation is not listening and is a topographical response rather than being behavior analytic in our responding. The reality is that behavior analysis, we have as a general field, as a broad field, we have a PR problem. Behavior analysts need to be humble. We need to operate in philosophical doubt. We need to stop operating in dogmatic responses. We need to question our privilege. And I am an autistic individual who has a lot of privilege. I have a lot of control over other autistics. And I have to question my privilege. And that's one of the reasons why I lovingly say that I'm a middle earther. Because yes, I'm a part of one community, and yes, I'm a part of another community, and I love both communities. But if I don't operate in that realm of philosophical doubt, if I don't question my assumptions, if I don't acknowledge that I operate from a place of extreme privilege, where I can literally destroy somebody's life through lack of discrimination, lack of awareness of something, then I am, by default, whether I intend to or not, being abusive. Behavior analysis as a field, we need to own this. We need to work together to solve it. No, I don't agree with the meme of all ABA is abuse. But I do agree with the core onus behind that, which is we need to fix our PR problem. And part of fixing our PR problem is improving our training, is making sure that we're practicing within our scope, is making sure that we're practicing with cultural competence, is making sure that we are operating at philosophical doubt instead of being dogmatic in our approach. And until that changes, we're going to continue facing this problem. This is an ongoing thing. We need to identify our values as a field and move towards it.
I just have one. Can I ask one question?
Let me have Ashton go first, and then I'll let you ask your question. Is that okay?
I'd actually allow.
Do you want
I'd
to? Okay,
ask
go
you a
for it.
question.
How as therapists, would you recognize abuse and listen to it from the person receiving therapy if something isn't working for them, or respecting what they want to learn and their goals, and to realize that sometimes this person might be younger, might be a child, without giving them a power struggle to get the voice heard?
Thank you so much for your question. I think that the biggest thing I always look for, anytime I'm taking a new case, because I am always looking for this problem, is how the individual is responding. So I think a key thing to look at is, how is your client demonstrating assent and consent to treatment, and how are you addressing those things? How are you, as a clinician, making sure that what is being utilized is of the best interest of the client and not necessarily what is most convenient or desired by the people who are probably writing your paycheck?
Answered it earlier too, but by learning it about the culture. And I can only speak to this from a trauma lens, but the same kind of things happen. We're very sensitive to certain things that other people are. I have very weird sensory issues that look very similar to someone with autism, but no one would know that unless I tell them. So I think learning about the person as an individual, learning about their culture is part of doing better, and learning how to not provide aversive stimuli or be abusive. Do you guys have anything you want to add? We're way over time. It's 4:27, but if anyone has questions.
Brian, do you want me to end the...
You can go ahead.
Okay.